leading to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the situation developing on the battlefield from the start of the war on February 24th until April 7th. Contrary to almost unanimous expectations, Russia, which has long been described as the country with the second strongest military in the world, was unable to defeat Ukraine. Russia's plan to rapidly force Ukraine into submission through overwhelming firepower on 4 different fronts utterly failed. The Ukrainian army, supported by the Western weapon supply, managed to withstand the initial Russian offensive without losing any of its major cities, save for Kherson in the south. Ukraine prevailed in the Battle of Kyiv and forced the Russian army to withdraw from the Kyiv, Zhytomyr, Chernihiv and Sumy oblasts. It held the line around Kharkiv. Despite the initial success of the Russian army in the south, namely the capture of Kherson, Russia failed to reach its main objective of capturing Odessa and taking the whole Black Sea shore under its control. It still looks like Russia's best bet to succeed is on the Donbas front, where Russia and its separatist allies have been making slow but steady progress since the beginning of the war. Moreover, the terrain of Donbas is more suitable for the Russian strategy of overwhelming the adversary through superior firepower. In this video, we're going to discuss the second phase of the war in Ukraine and the beginning of the Battle for Donbas, covering the events of April 8th to April 30th. In the background, cyber warfare quietly influences the fate of both nations, and you should be aware that similar techniques can be used by anyone on anyone, so getting some cybersecurity in your life is always helpful. And there's an easy way to get it: Threat Protection, the new service from NordVPN. While their VPN service encrypts data and bypasses regional restrictions, with Threat Protection, NordVPN does a lot more. If a fake link downloads a dangerous file, Threat Protection deletes it before any damage can be done. It warns you when a site is potentially unsafe, a phishing scam, or is going to harvest your data, and generally prevents trackers from compiling a personal profile on you online. It's like a layer of upgraded antivirus software. Just click a button in the corner of the Nord window and engage the new protections, and they remain effective whether you're using a VPN or not. It comes packaged with the standard NordVPN plans, which you can get more out of with our special offer. Get a 2-year plan and an extra month for free at nordvpn.com/kingsandgenerals. It's all risk-free with their 30-day money-back guarantee. The main events of April 8th are concerned with Russian missile strikes on the village of Krasnosilka, northeast of Odessa, and on Kramatorsk, as the Russian Ministry of Defense claimed that it hit the training base of foreign volunteers in Krasnosilka with the Bastion missile system. In Kramatorsk, a Russian Toshka-U missile struck the train station, killing more than 50 civilians, who gathered there to evacuate to safer parts of Ukraine. Russian media and governmental sources attempted to deny their culpability, claiming that their army doesn't possess any Toshka-U missiles, but sources are clear that Russia operates at least a few. On April 9th, Putin appointed the commander of the Russian Southern Military District, General Alexander Dvornikov, to overall command over Russia's military campaign in Ukraine, probably hoping that this will improve the command structure. Dvornikov was previously the Russian commander in its Syrian campaign, and is known in some quarters as the Butcher of Syria for targeting civilian areas. Dvornikov was already the commander of the Donbas front, where Russia was making slow progress in the first weeks of the war. And since now Russia's focus was mainly drawn to this area of Ukraine, it was not surprising that he was appointed to this position. But so far, nothing is indicating that Dvornikov has changed the overall military strategy of Russia in Ukraine, as Russia is still struggling to establish any kind of supremacy on the battlefield. In general, on April 8th to 10th, there were no major military and operational developments on the fronts. The Russian 1st Guards Tank Army took Breshkivka south of Izium, but was stopped in Dubrovna and Tavhenka. The 4th Motor Rifle Brigade made some gains towards Popasna, while the Ukrainian 21st National Guard and the 60th Mechanized Brigade counterattacked south of Kryvyi and made minimal gains there. The 80th Air Assault Brigade and the 35th Marine Corps units of the Ukrainian Army continued pressuring the Russian 33rd Motor Rifle Division, 255th Motor Rifle Division, and the 20th Guards Motor Rifle Division in Kherson Oblast. In Mariupol, the Russian army continued methodically destroying the city and decreasing pockets of resistance. By this point, it had become increasingly clear that the Russian units around the city of Kharkiv and in the occupied south of the country would not be attempting any major offensive operations, as their main goal had become to keep the Ukrainian units in these regions busy in order to prevent them from being redeployed to Donbas. The meeting of the Austrian Chancellor Karl Nehammer with Vladimir Putin in Moscow on April 11th, which was the first visit by a Western leader to Russia since the start of the invasion, indicated that Russia was still resolute in its willingness to continue its campaign in Ukraine, despite major setbacks and losses on the battlefield. Nehammer said that Putin believed that he was winning the war. On April 12th to 13th, the most important events developed in besieged Mariupol. By then, the main pocket of resistance of the Ukrainian forces was the Azovstal Iron and Steel Works, which is like a city in a city, covering almost 11 square kilometers of land with underground tunnels stretching to almost 24 kilometers. This also turned Azovstal into a shelter for civilians, along with being almost an impregnable fortress. On April 12th, the Azov battalion claimed that Russia used some sort of chemical weapon against them in Azovstal, but this claim was not proven. On April 13th, a group of soldiers and officers from the Ukrainian 36th Marine Brigade reportedly surrendered to the Russians after days of fierce resistance, which demonstrates just how dire the situation of the Mariupol defenders was. Still, another group of the 36th Marine Brigade joined Azov in the defense of Azovstal. The Ukrainian army lacked the capacity to break the siege of the city, which basically left the remaining Mariupol defenders on their own. But April 13th also brought a huge propaganda win for Ukraine. Ukraine claimed to hit the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, the Moskva cruiser, with 2 Neptune anti-ship cruise missiles. While Russia denied the Moskva was hit by a missile, it acknowledged an explosion on the cruiser and its subsequent sinking. Our video on that topic has been published and you can watch it via the link in the description and top right corner. On April 14th, Ukraine carried out the second helicopter attack in Russia, this time in Bryansk Oblast. Russia claimed that residential areas were shelled in Klemovo and Spodoreshino. Ukrainian sources countered with the claim that the Russian army shelled its own village during the attempt to bring down their helicopter. The situation on the front remained relatively stable. Russia continued its tactic of sending small groups of reinforcements to the front line in Donbas and engaging in offensives with small units. This is probably an indicator that Russia continued to suffer from its inability to coordinate offensive actions among large land and air units to gain any decisive advantage on the battlefield. While Russia made some very minor gains in the Donbas front, Ukraine claimed to liberate Rohan in Kharkiv Oblast and some villages and towns north of Kherson. Also, reports of major partisan activity in Melitopol emerged on these dates. On April 16th to 17th, Russia completed the capture of the port of Mariupol, now reducing the Ukrainian resistance in the city only to the Azovstal. On April 18th, the Ukrainian President Zelensky stated that Russia had started an offensive in the Donbas region, which indicated that the redeployment of Russian units from the Kyiv and Kharkiv fronts to the southeast had largely been completed. Overall, on April 16th to 18th, Ukraine made some gains southeast of Chuhuiv as the 2nd Brigade liberated Malinivka, Lebiezha and Basilivka, while also reinforcing the vicinity of Kharkiv with the 93rd Mechanized Brigade, either for Kharkiv's defense or for a potential counterattack. Russia's main offensive operations on these days took place towards Hulepole by the 71st Guards Motorized Rifle Regiment, 42nd Guards Motor Rifle Division, 291st GMRR and 42nd GMRD, which was repelled by the Ukrainian 110th Territorial Defense Unit. On April 19th to 21st, Russia captured Kremina in Luhansk Oblast and made progress in Rubizhne and Popasna. It was estimated that on these dates, Russia had around 25 BTGs on the front from Izium to Popasna, but even such a large concentration of troops did not enable Russian forces to make any sort of rapid advance. The Russian attempt to regain Malinivka failed. Elsewhere, the Russian 13th GTR, 4th GTD, 752nd MRR and 3rd MRD attack on Breshkivka, Divbrona and Dovhenka was repelled by the Ukrainian 81st Air Assault Brigade and 2nd UVC Battalion. The 1st Air Assault UVC defended Avdiivka from the 60th SG-MRB and elements of the 5th CAA, while Sparta Battalion of the DNR Separatists and the Khan Battalion saw their attack towards Marinka fail against the 54th Mechanized Brigade. In Zaporizhia, the 59th Motorized Brigade repelled the Russian invaders in Orikhiv. The 110th Territorial Defense Unit defeated an attack on Halaypola. The assault on Temirivka and Velika Novosilka of the 70th GMRR and 42nd GMRD failed too. Russia also failed to take Trodolyobivka south of Kryvyi Rih, as the 60th Mechanized Brigade defended the town from the 11th GAAB. On April 20th, the Ukrainian commander of the 36th Marine Battalion in Mariupol, Major Serhiy Volhyna, made what he called his last address to the world, where he stated that the Ukrainian defenders of the city were running out of supplies. The unlikeliness of breaking the encirclement of Mariupol made the loss of the city almost inevitable, but the Azovstal was still standing. Despite this, on April 21st, Putin declared victory in Mariupol as he ordered the defense minister Sergei Shoigu to blockade the Azovstal instead of trying to capture it, which would cause massive amounts of casualties. 12 BTGs were reported to be involved in the siege of Mariupol, and the announcement of the victory in Mariupol would free many Russian units to be redeployed elsewhere, while some of them would have to stay to maintain the blockade. It is unclear how battered these units were, and how many of them could have joined the Zaporizhian front. On April 22nd, the deputy commander of Russia's Central Military District, Major General Rustam Minukiev, stated that the aim of the second phase of the Russian campaign in Ukraine was to take Donbas and southern Ukraine under full control, along with creating a land corridor with Transnistria, a pro-Russian separatist puppet regime in Moldova, where according to him, there was evidence that the Russian-speaking population is being oppressed. In reality, this breakaway Moldovan territory has been under Russian control for almost 3 decades, and Moldova never made serious attempts to change the situation. Still, this demonstrated that the war in Ukraine could escalate, and would bring Moldova, and potentially its NATO member ally Romania, into the conflict. On the 23rd to 28th of April, most important developments and heavy fighting once again took place on the Donbas front. On April 24th, the units of the 201st Military Base of Russia seized Lozova in the Donetsk Oblast and reached the outskirts of Liman. It also ensured minor advances around Severodonetsk, capturing several small towns and building a pontoon bridge across the Krasna River, west of Severodonetsk. On April 26th, the Institute of War Studies analyzed how Russia had changed its approach to offensive operations and had started to apply a sounder and safer pattern of operational movement in Donbas, particularly along the front line from Izium to Rubizhne. Instead of continuous frontal assaults of separate units along vast fronts, with weak logistical support and weak fire support from supporting units, Russia had started pushing the Ukrainians down by moving through more or less parallel roads within supporting distance of each other, ensuring protection for each other from the flanks. On these dates, Russia was pushing from Izium southwest towards Bavinkova and southeast towards Slovyansk. There are also several columns bypassing Rubizhne with an intent to encircle the city. It looks like a potentially coordinated move from Izium in the north and from the separatist-controlled Donetsk Oblast in the south to encircle the Ukrainian troops fighting in Slovyansk, Kramatorsk, Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, Rubizhne, Popasna, and surrounding areas. If such encirclement is secured, it will be a major problem for Ukraine, but it is yet to be seen whether depleted and demoralized Russian units still have the capability for such a breakthrough. The Russian doctrine calls for 2 circles to be formed around the enemy pockets, with the bigger outer one tasked with repelling counterattacks from outside the pocket, and the second inner one to fight and reduce the pocket with concentrated direct and indirect fire, as well as aerial attacks. It is not clear if the Russians have enough manpower to create even 1 circle in such a vast area, let alone 2. This, as well as the fact that the Russians made almost no progress in Zaporizhia, might make such an operation impossible, It should be noted that on the 27th, the Russian Chief of General Staff, the second highest leader of the Russian army, Valery Gerasimov, was appointed the overall commander of the Izium offensive, which proves how crucial this area is for the Russian plans, and might imply that Putin is not entirely happy with Dvornikov's progress. Meanwhile, the 239th Guards Tank Army and the 90th Guards Tank Division continued their advance towards Rubizhne, and it looks like they managed to push the Ukrainian defenders of the city to its south. The details of this battle are unclear, but a few Russian and separatist sources admitted that their side suffered massive losses, as the bad coordination between the infantry, artillery and air force forced the infantry to attack head-on. It is possible that the Ukrainians were able to retreat to their well-prepared positions in the southern part of the city. The Russian 57th Guards Motor Rifle Division and the 127th Motor Rifle Division kept on putting pressure on Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. The 150th Motorized Rifle Division had also made some progress in Popasna against the 24th Ukrainian Mechanized Brigade. The Ukrainian units around Kharkiv tried to conduct counter-offensive operations in the area and recaptured Kutuzivka and looked to seize control of the E-105 highway, which is a vital supply line for the Russian Donbas offensive. But Russia continued maintaining a large presence in the area, which the Ukrainian General Staff estimates at least 7 BTGs of the 6th CAA and naval infantry of the Baltic Fleet. This prevents Ukraine from redeploying its units in the area to Donbas. On April 23rd to 28th, Russia continued to conduct offensive operations along the Orkhiv-Velika Novosilka line in Zaporizhia, bolstered by some of the units redeployed from Mariupol. While the 59th Mechanized Brigade held their positions in Orkhiv and the 110th Territorial Defense Unit repelled the attack of the 42nd Guards Motor Rifle Division in Huliepole, other elements of the 42nd Guards Motor Rifle Division and the 163rd Guards Tank Regiment made several kilometers of progress in Temirivka and Velika Novosilka, but were eventually stopped by the 53rd Mechanized Brigade and overwhelming artillery shelling. Again, the final goal of the Russian operations in Zaporizhia is not entirely clear. The goal may be to stop the redeployment of the Ukrainian troops to Donbas, or to achieve a breakthrough on the Orkhiv-Velika Novosilka line to attempt a broader encirclement of the Ukrainian units in Donbas. In South Ukraine, both sides tried to make gains, but the situation remained stable, as Russia made small gains towards Alexandrivka and Tavrizhka, while there was notable Ukrainian partisan activity in Kherson and Melitopol, where Ukrainian saboteurs managed to destroy the railway bridge across the Malye-Utlyok River, creating further problems for the Russian logistics out of Crimea. Russia's main transport hub in the Kherson occupation zone, the Kherson airport in Chernobyivka, is under almost constant shelling by the Ukrainian army, as on April 24th, the Ukrainian officials stated that the 17th attack on Russian military infrastructure and positions in Chernobyivka has occurred, which makes it more difficult for Russians to resupply in the southern front. Despite the Russian declaration of victory in Mariupol, Russia continued its attacks in and around the Azovstal defensive perimeter. On April 25th, troubling news came from the Moldovan region of Transnistria. Explosions at the so-called State Security Ministry in Transnistria were reported, which Western experts assessed to be a probable false flag attack by Russia to create an excuse for a potential intervention into Moldova. Russia maintains a military base in Transnistria with 2 motorized rifle battalions, which can act as a foothold for a potential attack on Moldova. But in total, Russian and separatist troops in the region probably amount to less than 7,000, which makes it unlikely to be used against Ukraine. The situation around Transnistria became even more complicated on the 27th, when Russia destroyed the only bridge connecting northern and southern parts of the Odessa Oblast, thus leaving the south portion with only one way to connect with the north, and possibly decreasing the chance of Romanian support for Ukraine. With the sinking of Moskva, it seems that Russia doesn't have the capability for a naval invasion of southern Odessa to link up with the troops in Transnistria, but it is a good idea to watch this developing situation. Russia continued to target transportation and urban infrastructure in western Ukraine, vital for the supply of its troops fighting on the front lines. Bellingcat reported that by April 24th, Russia had likely used 70% of its total precision missile stockpile, while Ukraine got a major boost on the diplomatic front. On April 26th, a meeting of defense ministers of NATO member states and its allies throughout the world in Germany resulted in important pledges about continuing and increasing military support to Ukraine. Moreover, on April 28th, the US Congress adopted the Lend-Lease for Ukraine. More and more artillery units, armored vehicles, tanks, anti-tank weapons, military aircraft, and other types of military vehicles and supplies are going to be delivered to Ukraine throughout May and June. In total, the US is planning to send $33 billion to help Ukraine, which on top of what was already pledged, is at least equal to the Russian military budget in 2022. Overall, throughout April, Czechia and Poland are reported to have sent T-72 tanks, Slovakia sent S-300 air defense systems, the US sent C-4 and M114 howitzers, Javelin anti-tank missiles, Mi-17 helicopters, armored Humvees, M1113 personnel carriers, Switchblade drones, Phoenix drones, and M18A1 Claymore anti-personnel mines. France provided Milan anti-tank missile systems and Caesar howitzers. The UK sent Starstreak anti-aircraft missiles and anti-tank missiles, while Germany has reportedly decided to give Ukraine Gepard air defense systems. The decrease of the Russian precision missile stockpile handcuffs Russia from completely disrupting the import of this military supply, despite the assurances of Putin to make a lightning-fast response to any intervention from a third party into the war in Ukraine. On April 29th to 30th, Ukraine continued its counter-offensive operations around Kharkiv. The 72nd Mechanized Brigade liberated Slatina, Prudianka, and Lozova north of Kharkiv, and continued its attempts to reach the border. This Ukrainian success might force the Russians to pay more attention to the defense of territories captured by them in the Kharkiv Oblast. South of Izium, Russia continued its unsuccessful attempts to take strategically important Bavinkovo, while the 74th Guards Motor Rifle Brigade advanced to Yampil, inching a bit closer to the Seversky Donets River, where analysts claim the Ukrainians are planning to make a stand. Heavy battles continued in Popasna, Rubizhna, and along the Severodonetsk salient. It was reported that Ukraine deployed the 4th and the 17th Tank Brigades to bolster their defences in what is now the most important theatre of the war. The second phase of the Russian invasion of Ukraine has not brought any major breakthroughs for the Russian army. Russia has made some notable gains along the front line between Izium and Popasna, but the Ukrainian defences are intact and are awaiting a new supply of much-needed weapons from its allies. Ukraine's ability to redeploy reserve units to this area proves that they have the capability and manpower to bolster its defences. Despite some notable gains around Kharkiv, at this point, military experts doubt that Ukraine has enough firepower for an extended counter-offensive campaign against Russia, particularly in Donbas, but this could change with the deployment of new weapons, artillery units, and military vehicles promised by the West to the front line, while Russia's weapon and manpower reserves are diminishing. Military experts also note the increased importance of artillery, as it is being assessed as the primary reason why any of the sides have failed to make any major breakthroughs so far. Perhaps the import of modern and effective Western artillery systems into Ukraine could change the tide of the Battle of Donbas. Ukraine is becoming increasingly confident in not only withstanding the Russian offensive, but actually defeating them and driving them away, which is evident from the rhetoric of the Ukrainian military and civilian leaders, along with increased attacks on targets in the Russian cities of Voronezh, Kursk, and Belgorod, where a number of military and infrastructure objects were hit. Belgorod in particular seems to be attacked every night, often by the Bayraktar drones. It is curious why Ukraine uses these drones in this manner, but even though Russia claimed that 4 of them were destroyed in the last days of the month, it is clear they are getting some results. Along with that, on May 2nd, an explosion at the Perm ammunition plant occurred, and while it is still unclear how this happened, it could have easily been a saboteur job, similar to the way Belarusian opponents of the Russian invasion on occasion disrupted Belarusian railway supply lines to Russian troops fighting for Kyiv. On the last day of the month, Ukrainian sources claimed that the artillery barrage conducted against the Russian staging area near Izium killed another Russian major general, commander of the 2nd CAA, Andrei Simonov. According to the sources, 30 vehicles were destroyed and between 100 and 200 soldiers and officers were killed. Claims that the overall commander of the Izium offensive, Gerasimov, was wounded during the attack would prove to be false, but Simonov might be the 9th Russian general killed in this war. There are some expectations that the war in Ukraine would end before May 9th, the day on which Russia celebrates the victory in the Great Patriotic War. The general Russian rhetoric indicated that reaching the administrative borders of Donetsk Oblast and Luhansk Oblast would be propagated to the Russian public as a victory. But so far, nothing indicates that Russia is going to have any major breakthrough at the beginning of May. There have been some indicators of the Russian plan to declare the creation of new separatist regimes in captured regions of Ukraine, particularly in Kherson, where Russia is actively looking for local collaborators to appoint as new civilian administrators of occupied regions, and declared its intent to start using Russian rubles in those areas. However, the low-level insurgency, as well as the continued protests of the locals of Kherson Oblast, makes this referendum seem far-fetched. Russian manpower and weapon supply continues to diminish amidst fierce Ukrainian resistance. According to the British Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, Russia has lost 15,000 troops throughout the war by April 25th. Oryx military blog provides documentary evidence to the destruction of 600 Russian tanks, 1,207 different types of military vehicles, 71 command posts and communication stations, 12 heavy mortars, 162 pieces of artillery, 64 rocket launchers, 20 anti-aircraft guns, 55 surface-to-air missile systems, 26 military aircraft, and 39 helicopters. In comparison, Ukraine has documented losses of 145 tanks, 338 military vehicles, 53 pieces of artillery, 16 rocket launchers, 5 anti-aircraft guns, 42 surface-to-air missile systems, 20 military aircraft, 5 helicopters, and 7 Bayraktar TB2 drones. Remember that these are only losses which have video or photo evidence, and undoubtedly there are much more on both sides. There have been no recent reports of manpower losses by Ukraine. On April 16th, Zelensky claimed that 3,000 Ukrainian soldiers had been killed during the war, but since both sides tend to downgrade their losses, the Ukrainian casualties are probably much higher. It is worth remembering that, unlike Ukraine, Russia has not declared martial law and mobilization, which puts some limit on the personnel they can deploy in the war. There have been some rumors about Russia's preparation for mobilization in an attempt to compensate for its manpower losses. So far, Russia has denied these claims, but some expect the Russian government to engage in false flag attacks on its own territory, to blame the Ukrainians for it, and get an excuse for mobilization of its population on the pretext of protection of the motherland against foreign incursions. Continued gas and oil export, including to Europe, still helps the Russian economy to stay afloat and fund its war efforts, but amidst pressure from Ukraine, USA and UK, the European Union has been pondering the ban on oil imports as part of its 6th sanction package. At this point, Russia supplies 26% of the EU's oil imports, and despite opposition from Hungary, Austria and Slovakia, on May 2nd, it looked like the EU had been able to reach a consensus among its member states to adopt an oil ban on Russia. Russia also supplies 40% of the EU gas imports, and has demanded the payment for its gas in rubles. Publicly, many European politicians dismiss this demand as blackmail, and state that they're going to pay for the gas in euros. But Russia has already cut the gas supply to Poland and Bulgaria as a sign of its resolute stance on this issue. Since Europe is so heavily reliant on Russian gas supplies and does not have an immediate solution to potential gas shortages, it is yet to be seen how they're going to proceed. It was reported that several European gas companies are looking for ways to pay for the gas without breaching the sanctions regime, and the EU has pledged to provide more detailed guidance on the payment scheme to the European gas companies, which would not be in breach of sanctions. We're going to talk about the third month of the conflict in the coming weeks, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.